Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, joined with Robert Fry.
Today, my fellow podcast listeners, we will be talking a lot about StatCast video and how to best optimize its usage for coaching purposes, some overlays, some attentional blindness, novelty with constraints in a training environment, perspective control, and some deception.
Yeah, and part of our discussion was around a tweet about a study on how anticipation actually can make athletes more susceptible to deception. And so we kind of discussed that further, and that kind of kicked off our conversation today. So I hope you guys enjoy today's podcast.
Let's begin. Analyzing. Finding the edge.
We're in a good spot. All right. So Pitch AI may be an iPhone app, or is it not an iPhone app? And then some, like, the baseball world is split in half between iPhone and Android. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, because I mean, seriously, like for most of the technology that you can use, it seems like it's more feature-esque when you are under iOS rather than Android's operating systems, which I don't know the process of like app development between Android and iPhone. I know it's a lot easier to get your app developed and through the Google Play Store through Android rather than it is through the iOS, because the iOS takes more time. It's a more of a process there. But maybe in terms of like feature building, it's a lot easier in Android, or no, excuse me, a lot easier in iPhone than it is Android, because I don't know, maybe, because the design of iPhones are a lot more simplistic. So maybe the app building side of it too is more simplistic than Android. So maybe, but yeah, I mean, it's if you are in the baseball community and you use technology and you don't use some form of iOS, you're already behind. And me being a huge Android guy, it kind of sucks saying that, because I'm big into Android. A couple of years ago, I switched to iPhone, and within 3 days, my iPhone completely went to black, shut down, and that it was not on my end; it was on Apple's end. They sent me a faulty phone, and it took me another 2 weeks to get a new phone. And yeah, and so every Android I've had, aside from after using it for a while, the battery kind of sucks after a while. I've never had those kind of problems.
Yeah, I know. For me, since I've had an iPhone, I have like a 5S, and now the battery life on it lasts forever, but I also don't use it that much. So that's probably the other reason, is that how much you use it drains the battery quite a bit, what apps are running. So, but what are all the apps, typical apps that are stuck on for baseball on the iOS that aren't on Android? I thought they were on both.
So
most.
I know there's certain iOS apps that have more features. So like something that I used last year while coaching in a summer league was Blast Motion. And the thing is, luckily I had both an iPad and a Android tablet, but the iPad allows you to see things like the 3D swing tracer. They allow you to see more metrics than the Android does. But the one thing that the Android does have that I saw recently is you can see swings from, or it's a lot easier to get to swings from, a year ago rather than iOS has it more set up where it's like more of a recency type of, cache, if you want to call it, where they'll load the most recent swings. But if you haven't taken any swings in such a long time, then they won't load up. However, with Androids, you can pull up any swing at any time, at least through the apps. Now, I'm sure if you go on like the website, you can probably pull it up either way. But if you're just really on a an Android tablet compared to an iOS tablet, and let's say you want to see player X's swings in the fall, you're probably not going to be able to see that as quickly on an iOS device compared to an Android device.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely one thing. I don't know for sure, but I think Modus is more feature-esque on iOS compared to Android. And then there's more apps on iOS that I know. Someone that I've talked to, his name's Wes Anderson. He actually coaches nearby where I live. He coaches at Minooka Central High School, and he built a iOS app called like a bullpen pitch randomizer, where essentially you just the bullpen tells you, okay, here's your spot. It's a number. You got to hit that spot, and then you basically just store that into a database, and you say, all right, here's how frequently I hit my spots. Here's how I didn't hit my spots. It's a very simplistic app, but only on iOS.
Have you seen, do you follow Leg Kick Nation?
Yes.
On Twitter?
Yes.
Did you see the software that he's using or his facility is using for their live ABs?
I took a glance, but I didn't look that much into it. So
I don't know what software he's using other than the fact that it basically has some sort of machine learning or automated, it basically can automate the editing process for clipping all the videos.
See, that's and that's huge because I pulled it up, but that's huge because that's the thing that I personally want to accomplish, in the next couple of years, is be able to say, all right, basically be able to do what Synergy does, but myself, where, instead of having to watch like a 3-hour baseball game for an upcoming opponent, we can instead just, here you go, put it through machine learning and it just chops it up so and so. There's ways to do it, but you kind of have to catch for error catching. So I know in machine learning, there's a way to kind of use like a network where you can look into the batter's box. So if the batter's box is visible, each time a new batter steps in, that's when you say, okay, here's the new batter. This is when he comes up at this timestamp. But there may be times where, let's say, a runner scores, but he walks through the batter's box. That might count that as a new batter when it's really not the case.
Or if he steps all the way out in between pitches.
Right, exactly. So he steps all the way out in between pitches. So I guess another way, too, is you could probably combine it by saying, okay, person steps in his batter box and then read jersey number as well. So that way there's no duplicates at that end. So if one of those are present, then you shouldn't go to the next batter.
Well, I mean, I think it's more of the fact that you just need, if you're just thinking about clipping the videos, you just need start and end points. So hey, here are the characteristics of a start and end point. And I want you to clip this every time we get to a start and an end point.
Right. And so I think that's the big thing now for, college programs. They want video coordinators, and that's one of the jobs of those video coordinators, essentially, instead of sitting behind home plate and maybe, charting balls and strikes, have, a pitcher who maybe threw the day before or is going to throw the next day and have them chart, but then have that person just record timestamps. Okay, here's when player X's at bat started. Here's when it ends. Or then you can record, timestamps of here's when he swung, here's when, he hit the ball well, and then same for pitchers. Here's his strikes, here's his balls, so on and so forth.
Well, bats basically works like that. So it basically starts a clock. Once you start your charting, you basically, hit start for start of game, probably when the umpire says, play ball or whatever. And then you probably hit start, and then you just start tracking the game. And as you put in the different counts, it'll have timestamps and it'll know how to sync that with the video. Because my understanding, when you put in the video, you have to sync up the start points between all the different video. And then from there, it'll just go and clip everything. I've seen some of it. It's sometimes if you don't sync it quite right, and probably too, if you sync it just a little bit wrong on the initial batter, when you get into the third or fourth inning or later at bats, it becomes fairly unsynced.
Right, and then it'll add up over time. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think, and so on that end, I think one, like, yes, it's nice to have someone do kind of that end and kind of have that error checking, but two, wouldn't it be great if, for advanced scouting at the collegiate level or the amateur level in general, if you have your opponent's video, be able to just download that or upload a link, and then it automatically just, cuts the video for you. So where
Yeah.
maybe you can create, like, essentially what Synergy does, where you can create, let's say you upload this video of the game and you'll say, okay, the first pitch actually starts at 10 minutes in. And then you say the last pitch ends at, 2 hours, 47 minutes, and 33 seconds. And then from what we talked about earlier through that machine learning modeling, where, every time a batter steps in the box, then you can be able to, clip between certain batters or things in that sense where you don't have to dedicate, 3 to 6 to 9 hours for the weekend or, for Monday through Thursday for your Friday, Saturday, Sunday opponents rather than just upload it. All right, you got all the clips. Now you can just save a bunch of time and then be able to focus on, hey, let's start working on, our practice plan for this week, or let's start working on, maybe developing our players more. Not saying that, coaches don't really develop players. I'm just saying that there's not so much time in a given week to be able to do all of this stuff.
Right. And I think that's the biggest thing is with a lot of this technology, like technology should free you up to be able to do other things. And um I mean, that's where I'm looking at sort of this not just from a scouting standpoint because it all is dependent upon whether or not your opponent gets video or somebody gets video of your opponent, but just from a developmental standpoint, you being able to video your own players. And then once you have that footage that you're not spending hours and hours worth of time editing, you can actually spend your time analyzing. Um, and that saves you a ton of time to be able to work with players more. And so that to me is the huge benefit of that. Um, I guess what other things have you been thinking about
So
either in this
I
realm or
actually
other things?
purchased a video editing software that's basically the Windows version of iMovie, but with kind of more features. So right now, I'm essentially just
Hmm.
recreating what Pitching Ninja does with kind of those overlays, and then adding those ball trails as well. Because I think it's a great topic point for potentially working on tunneling, especially if if say you have a staff that
Hmm.
primarily is focused on sinker slider, where there's just a cut going either towards, if it's a right-handed pitcher, it's going towards the left-handed batter's box, or if it's the sinker, it's going towards this right-handed batter's box. So that's a great thing for tunneling. So I'm essentially just working on being able to create a trail and then highlight that tunnel point between two different pitches, and then basically going back. Let's say if there is kind of TrackMan or any type of data behind it that tells you kind of the release point, because I was able to figure out a way with TrackMan flight scope data. If I have the release point, I can be able to calculate the tunnel point. So then that way we could be able to calculate, okay, we can see it visually with video and then add in that overlay of data by saying, okay, here's the tunnel point. And here's how much the differential is between, your sinker and your slider.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely super interesting. I'd be curious to see to like just even the differences in release point, not necessarily just whether or not they're able to tunnel, but um maybe where release point is and then how that relates to where the ball ends up. and just more looking at it from a descriptive standpoint and observation, just trying to understand like, well, how do things kind of work currently? Um, and one of the things that I've recently started to look into a little bit along this line of thinking is been listening to a lot of talks by David Snowden, and he's talking about the CFIN framework. I'm not exactly sure how it's necessarily pronounced because it's apparently a Welsh. I believe it's a Welsh word, and it's CYNEFIN. And the reason that they kept it in Welsh is because it doesn't translate well into English. But I'm still trying to wrap my brain around all of it. It's super interesting though, because he was talking about like how as coaches, even when we're looking at video or watching a guy playing the game, that we often only see what we anticipate to see or what we expect to see, and because of that, we're often blind to other things. This is basically something that can be explained through concepts of perception, in that whatever we focus our attention on, we tend to have attentional blindness is the term, and so we don't see other things that we're not attending to. So, for example, everybody's heard, or a lot of people have heard of the passing basketball experiment, and I think we might have talked about this on a previous podcast as well, but it bears repeating. And so participants were asked to count the number of times they passed a basketball around, and a man in a gorilla walks through, or a person in a gorilla suit walks through, and they then after they asked like, well, how many times have you did you count the basketball getting passed back and forth? You know, did you get like 16 or whatever? And then they ask, well, how many people saw the gorilla? And a lot of people miss that. The same thing, they did this with radiologist, I want to say, technicians, and they were looking at x-rays, and they were looking at or x-rays or trying to remember what the other thing that they look at, like MRIs and stuff like that, other images, and they're looking for tumors or whatever. And they put in some of these images a very large gorilla, not like super small, but like a good sized gorilla. And a lot of the radiologists missed picking this up. And so it kind of speaks to this fact that oftentimes when we're looking at players, we tend to only see what we expect to see. And so that can be problematic in the sense that there's a lot of other information that we're just completely missing. And there's some other really great nuggets as well in terms of like this too, I think, you know, speaks to somebody who likes to run different experiments, and, you know, the power of n to the one, so to speak. And the thing is that when we try something and it ends up working, a lot of times that can be attributed to simply to novelty. Like we tend to respond to novelty. So the example that David gives in one of his talks is that this company did they did an experiment where they increased the amount of light in the room, and it increased productivity. And they're like, wow, okay, so this must be the new thing, that if workplaces have brighter lights, then people will be more productive. And so they kind of ran with that. And then they conducted another experiment where they lowered the light, and they found the exact same thing, that people's productivity increased because they changed the lighting. And so really sometimes you have to actually run parallel experiments or have multiple experiments going simultaneously to kind of work out those effects. Um, and so I think that's something that we have to keep in mind when we are working with athletes and running different experiments, because sometimes, just simply it being a new novel experience can be beneficial for an athlete. And to me, this speaks to the fact that we should have a novelty within our training environment, um, because it does help enhance the acquisition of skill. And I think that is very much a part of like the ecological approach is how we can utilize novelty for skill acquisition. Now, we shouldn't be doing it all the time as much as possible, but having a healthy dose of that mixed within your normal training, I think is highly beneficial.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, as you were talking, like, a ton of thoughts came to my head. So, like, one that came to my head in terms of that novelty was, a couple of years ago when I was working as a stock boy at a grocery store, we would have like these basically sheets, and you would be assigned to an aisle, and basically, you're basically saying, like, okay, if you have 60 items on your cart or whatever, you're expected to, stock within 65 minutes, things along those lines. But
Mm-hmm.
something that I found was whenever I would take a new way to work, or just a different way to work prior than the previous day I worked, it turned out that I actually
Mm-hmm.
did better than, just taking the same way to work over and over. Because it's like,
Mm-hmm.
we want to be able to say, okay, hey, I always like seeing people. It's like, what do you like about your job? And they say there's always something new every day. So
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
it's not like the same old, because once you get into kind of that repetitive environment, you're like, I've already done this before. Like, do I really need to keep doing it?
Or two, you don't have to be cognitively present.
Right.
It doesn't force you to adapt or to change.
Right. Because you're just like, I've done this before. Okay, we'll just get it over with.
Go on autopilot. Yeah.
So it's like, yeah. And so the thing with that, in terms of like, going back to athletes, is yes, creating that type of, novelty where, oh, hey, we're going to take BP. But now it's like, hey, we're going to take BP, but except you're going to get thrown a ball from a right-handed pitcher, but then immediately after you finish your swing, a left-handed, say you have two L screens, a left-handed pitcher is going to throw at you. And so you have to be able to read
Mm-hmm.
both, or, just continuing to work on those environments of, those different environments. That way you can be like, well, it's something new because you may not expect it. And then another thing that did come up while you were talking is about, that attentional blindness. It's where, when does that, for athletes, when does that become a good thing, and when does that become detrimental?
So remember when I tagged you, Ethan, and Charlie? I can't remember who else I tagged in, but there was the tweet that went out on the study for soccer players, and when they anticipated or had I think it was anticipation. I'll actually have to go look that up real quick. But essentially, when they anticipated, um, give me a quick sec. I want to actually get this more correct. I feel like it wasn't that long ago that I tagged you all into this. Also, tagged Josh Rodriguez. Okay. Let's go here. What was this? Knowledge of an opponent's preferences made a player more susceptible sorry. Knowledge of an opponent's preferences made a player more susceptible to deception. And so to me, that comes back a little bit to anticipation. And maybe sometimes when we know too much information about an opposing pitcher or an opposing player, maybe for some guys who are aware of their strengths or their weaknesses, or their scouting report, they can use that to their advantage to be more deceptive to the hitter. And so I wonder if that goes to what you were talking about in terms of attentional blindness, like because you're focused, your attention is focused on what you're anticipating coming next, doesn't allow you to actually connect with what's actually or connect to the information that's actually happening in front of you. And it skews your perception of what's going on. So it makes you more susceptible to deception.
Yeah, and the thing that immediately came up was when Chris Carpenter, the former Cardinals pitcher, when he won Comeback
Mhm.
Player of the Year in 2009 after basically missing 2 full seasons in 07-08. That was the second year where they had pitch effects, so it wasn't quite, to the level of Statcast, but it was still saying
Mhm.
that. But what he did was, since he knew that other teams were able to scout his recent start, he would do the opposite of essentially what the scouting report was. So that led to more
Mhm.
deception. And that said, he said that was a big thing to his success, where he was saying, okay, my last start against Milwaukee, I was throwing a lot of fastballs first time around. Now, when I play
Mhm.
Pittsburgh, I'm going to throw curveballs first time around more frequently. And so that led to
Mhm.
more deception because maybe those teams were like, okay, based on this data, we can see that, okay, he's throwing fastball, fastball, fastball. But then he's like, no, I'm going to start you off with more curveballs first time around. And then the second time around, I'll be like, I don't know what to expect now.
Right. And I think that can be more easily utilized by a pitcher. Um, I think that's a little bit harder for a hitter to use, but it does, at least to me, speak to the fact that sometimes, um, actually, now I remember what I was actually going to say. So, where this kind of jumps off to me is that some of the things that I've been looking into, as far as like from the hitter's perspective, of this idea and this concept of perspective control, or online control of action. So basically, being able to, the information that you're receiving in the present helps you understand what is going to be happening in the present future, essentially. So as information comes out in real time, it lets you know where things are about to go, but it doesn't necessarily always tell you where it's going to end up, but it's giving you more information about the things that are about to unfold. And so, one thing though that amateurs or intermediate athletes will do is they'll develop heuristics when, for example, the information is either coming too fast or the task is simple enough that you can use simple heuristics. And so, for people who are less familiar with what the word heuristic means, the overly simplified definition, is a shortcut. So essentially, you're developing a a little shortcut. You're picking up like one piece of information and then you're using it to basically, tell you what you think is going to happen. And so heuristics tend to be approximate. They don't tend to be highly accurate. So they get you in the ballpark. And so with that, I think a lot of how we have trained hitters is to develop heuristics so that they can be approximately right, just because we're like hitting's really hard. So let's try to figure out, these basic heuristics. So, I'm trying to think of a good one here in terms of like how oftentimes we'll tell guys to just hunt fastballs, or to hunt fastballs elevated. So we're trying to give them a heuristic, a very like a shortcut to narrow their focus a little bit to a certain area. And or don't miss your fastball, which essentially I think makes it harder for could potentially work against hitters if say the pitcher hangs a breaking ball. So a ball that they could potentially drive just as well, they lay off because they're sitting dead red on a fastball and they're only geared up to hit a fastball. So in essence, because they they have this heuristic of focusing on making sure they get their fastball. Essentially, they have attentional blindness to the hanging breaking ball that they should be able to crush. Now, I know some coaches have their philosophy is broad enough to encapsulate that, because if you switch it to this idea of only swing at pitches that you can do damage with, that would include the hanging breaking ball, right? So it changes the focus, so that the deception, I guess, piece, or like the attentional blindness for what we really care about, is minimized.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So you kind of think of it in this way where you want to be able to maybe instead of focusing on, in your case, the elevated fastball, maybe just think about something completely different. Maybe say, all right, just see the batter's eye out there, just focus on one spot for me. And that way, you don't have to have this attentional blindness towards, another pitch because now you're focusing on one pitch rather than now you're just focusing on, the batter's eye. Hey, ball comes, I'm going to make contact in kind of a different way of approaching it.
Well, and I think from a training standpoint, right, is there can be a lot of benefit to that of like, okay, let's see how many balls can you find a way to drive to center field or to the batter's eye, right? And from that, we can go back to kind of the novelty idea of I was thinking about this, all the time that we talk about, for athletes, like find a way to get better today. I also think we should also challenge athletes. I want you to try something new today. Like every day you go to practice, I want you to do something you've never done before today. Like try to do it. Doesn't matter if you fail or you succeed. Just that, did you do something that new today? Did you try something new today? And I think that will, the hope is to essentially have what happened when you took a new way to work each day when it came to your productivity. There's something about that experience that helps you better understand things that you normally do. And so, I don't think we necessarily have to always understand the inner workings of how something works, just that, the principles behind of what it will do and how it can enhance your performance by trying new things. And so I think as important as it is to, trying to find a way to get better every day, I think it's equally as important to try something new every day, which I do think would also help with finding a way to get better every day.
Yeah, no, I am with you there because then now you're opening yourself up. You're opening your boundaries in a sense where instead of let's say you're more focused on a lot of long toss, but say all right, hey, try something new, try throwing with weighted balls today. That's just as a basic example. And so maybe he, this pitcher throws with the weighted balls. Now he's like, hey, this is actually doing pretty well for me. And then that way you can continue broaden your horizons and say, all right, now instead of, now let's say I'll throw with weighted balls, but now I'll go to, an adjusted form of long toss or something along those lines where maybe you're going back to kind of your roots, if you will, from what you know, but now you're kind of adding newness to it or adding novelty, as you mentioned, where now we can say, all right, instead of just doing long toss, now we're going to do long toss this way. Or, from a hitter's perspective, we can say, all right, now instead of, just hitting for to hit, let's hit directionally. Let's say, okay, we're going to spray balls this way, we're going to spray balls this way. Or being able to create that by saying, okay, well, let's not focus on, I don't want to say being a one trick pony, but being able to be more adaptable in this case, where you can say, all right, well, let's do this thing and let's continue to build on it from going back to our roots and then continue to adding to our knowledge. And then, you'll get this moment of, I guess, zen, if you will, where it's like, wow, most of the stuff that I learned in the past and the stuff that I'm now learning, now we're bringing it together. And now we're focusing on the new thing where you're combining elements.
Right. And I do want to put a caveat in with the novelty thing and trying something new. I think when you're doing that, you also have to make sure that it's in the appropriate places, because we also don't want to get injured, right? So like, to me, if it's like a high intent thing, maximal load, say for example, like you talked about long toss. So in that process, maybe trying something new more when you're closer in, like understand what your capabilities are and how much outside the norm are you asking of yourself, and try to not be too far out, especially like, say, for example, like let's say you're squatting near your maximum, right? You don't want to try to experiment with your form when you have, you know, you're 90% on the bar or more, right? So kind of the same thing here when it comes to throwing or whatever. Like when you're doing high intent work, if you're out at your max distance, that's not the best time to try to throw it sidearm or from underneath, and see how far you can flip it all the way out there. Like that's probably not, especially if you've never done it before, and I think back to when I was coaching NAIA and I was talking with their center fielder, and he was like, yeah, I had an arm injury last year or the year before or whatever. And, I heard it because I picked a ball and I tried to flip it in sidearm, or from down underneath, throwing it back into the infield. And it was like, okay, he tried something new there, and his body was not prepared for it. And he strained his forearm or his UCL. So, that's where we have to be smart with how we do this and when and where we do this. And it's going to be different for every guy. Like, like the shortstop on that same team could throw from down under, like, 200 plus feet, and it was going to hurt his arm. But he did a lot of stuff like that. He threw from a lot of different arm slots, and he had been doing that for a long time. And so it really just comes back to like, how well prepared is your body to do these different things. So when you're trying something new, also have an appreciation for how risky is what you're going to do to injure you. And we still got to take some risk, but you want to take calculated risk. I think that's the most important thing. And that was the same thing that David Snowden was talking about, is that when we're running parallel experiments and stuff, you want to be running safe, relatively, like, or when we're dealing with complex systems and we're going to run experiments, we need to appreciate the fact that it's more than likely going to fail because of the complexity of things. Like complex systems tend to, things don't work out. So you want to take very calculated, non-threatening risks. And so when we're talking about novelty, you should take, you shouldn't take out lopsided or highly risky experiments or novel movements. So try something new within your bounds that that you can safely do, I think is a good way. Like, just like driving a new way to work. Well, you also want to leave yourself enough time to get there on time, right? So it's not, you need to have an appreciation for like the context and that you're going to be able to achieve the things that you need to achieve without risking losing your job as, going to work, for an example.
Right. Yeah. Because then you create, so you're basically just working within, trying something new, but within constraints or bounds, like you mentioned, where you can. So yeah, going back to the long toss thing, don't obviously try to flip it overhand when you're at 350 feet between two players. Like that's not going to bode well.
Or pick up an 11 ounce and you haven't consistently been throwing it with an 11 ounce and just try to throw it 300 plus feet. Like that's not a good idea.
Or on the converse side, pick up a lyre ball and just try to whip it as hard as you can. That may conversely also not be very potentially well for you when let's say through most of the long toss you're just throwing with a regular baseball. You don't want to bring this small ball and just whip it immediately, because then your body might be telling you, no, like, don't do that, please stay away from that.
Mm-hmm. And that's some of the things though, when I'm thinking about like doing novelty and new things, what will happen and what tends to happen when you start sampling new ideas, you do new experiments, you fail. What comes from that is you begin to learn and new opportunities for movement begin to emerge out of that. Like all of a sudden you'll be like, you know what, I think I can do this today. Like say for example, like you were saying, like picking up a 2 or 3 ounce ball. Like I think I can throw this, from this arm angle or throw it this distance or um I'm trying to think of like even just with a regular ball, like today I can actually figure out how to throw this on the run. Let's say I'm an infielder and I'm struggling with something like that. Like new movement capabilities will begin to emerge through this exploration and through this novel movement or this novel experimentation.
Yeah, and so you kind of think of it, and from a batter standpoint, because now I kind of think of it in this sense where in terms of using these different types of balls, or in the batter sense, maybe an overload slash underload bat, allowing yourself to be like, okay, if you think you can do this today, go for it, but you know, being able to also recognize that after a few swings, be like, no, this is like my body's telling me something like, don't don't feel like you have to push yourself through that limit like right away, because
Mm-hmm.
then you're just in, now that it comes to the point where now this calculated risk becomes just risk. You're taking out the calculation part of it because you're just more focused on, oh no, since I started, I have to finish this.
Right. It's the difference of like using a regular weighted bat versus grabbing Bryce Harper's like 37-48 or whatever and
Right.
trying to swing that thing.
Right.
I don't remember exactly what his weighted bats that he was swinging at like age 17 or whatever, but like I mean those things were just mammoth bats and those were not your traditional like they're not driveline overload bats, like it's not like that, right?
Analyzing.
Because I know I had been talking to you about, or you and Ethan were bringing up the fact that there's a new video database, right, for MLB and a lot of the plays and stuff that you're able to get on Statcast and all that sort of data. You guys have been able to find the video that accompanies that data, more or less.
Yeah, and so that's a big thing because now, you know, especially as we were talking about earlier, being able to cut video. The other thing to be able to do that with, and the video editor that I got now is able to do that, where you can overlay that data on top of
Mm,
it, where you can say, all right, here's the spray angle, here's the exit velocity, launch angle, so on and so forth, with that video, because with all of the players that you're coaching, the athletes, some of them might be able to understand, okay, here's numbers, here's how you get better. Others might be able to understand, oh, here's video, here's how you get better. But then others building onto that might need a combination of both. And so that's where
mm,
it comes
mm.
in, where getting that data and overlay system kind of going allows us to create that.
Yeah, actually, on that note, like kind of what I was getting at before with looking at the overlays is that I wonder too if you could even look at like success versus um non-success. So for example, like you do the overlays for pitching, like okay, which are the locations that or release points that lead to strikes or lead to swing and misses. Hey, here are all the release points of balls that have good break and break out of the zone. Like they'll start in the zone, they end up out of the zone. Or here are all the release points for your fastball that end up in the strike zone or something like that. And maybe it's not just that. Maybe like you also do the overlay and you're like, actually, here's where the big difference is like how your lead arm or lead shoulder or trunk is rotating and like, hey, it it alters this, and maybe it alters the release point. Maybe the release point is the same. But it'd be cool to see in the overlay um, what that variation is, and like where's the good variation and potentially what the bad variation looks like.
Right. So then you essentially create those bounds, through some statistical method. So you could use like Z scores, standard deviation, stuff like that, where essentially you're just saying, okay, within this, we'll call it buckets. Within these buckets of release points, here's where your good variation is at. And then within these buckets of release points, here's where your bad variation is at. And speaking on top of that, there was a picture list article that came out. I think it was like yesterday. Ethan did retweet it, and that's how I found it out. But basically, it was this guy that helped kind of some of these major league pitchers, where while they had this video of them pitching, he would basically overlay kind of where in the zone with what pitch they were throwing was the most successful, and he would use kind of like a color scheme where it's like red is bad, blue is good. And being able to create that on top of a video is also crucial. And then, like you brought up, being able to understand release points. So basically creating like, I guess, like a little square of buckets, if you will, and say, all right, here's where your good variation release point's at. So if you release here, you're going to expect good variation. But if you release here, you're going to expect bad variation. So then that way you can continue to develop and say, okay, hey, I'm focusing on here. So that way, when you are, throwing, help the pitchers or help the batters understand, hey, try to help them understand, hey, when I move my arm this way or when I do this specific movement, I'm going to expect good variation. And, have them like commit that, not necessarily like commit that to, short-term memory, but kind of commit that to more long-term memory. So that way, when we come into what we talked about earlier about attentional blindness, they don't have to be like focusing on, okay, I got to get my release point this way, when, that's only one part of the equation.
Yeah. And two, like if I'm thinking about it from an ecological perspective, it's like, okay, what information are they connecting with, or where is their focus of attention? Like, is it more internal or is it more external? What other outside factors too could be affecting their focus of attention? What other sort of kind of rate limiters? For example, like pressure, whether that's coming from the opposing team, the score, an umpire, a coach, or somebody in the stands, etc. What things could also be affecting their system and the outcomes that we're seeing? Because maybe when if we were to create some sort of a pressure situation, would their movement patterns like become more rigid or more variable, and maybe it would have a certain characteristic. So it'd be very interesting to see, like, and that's where to me, like, gathering data and actually looking at it would really help us out, because I do think sometimes we try to take theories that we have developed and we're like, I think this makes logical sense. And then you try to force everybody into that theory without just first observing the data and just understanding, okay, what is, like, what does success look like? Because oftentimes we haven't even looked at it yet. And we're like, oh, this is breaking all the rules of our theory and we need to change them. And it's like, but they're having success. Like, why are we going to change this? And then you're like, then you find somebody who it's not working on, and then you're like, oh, okay, so then let's get them into this parameter. And it's like, well, maybe again, just like that, that example I gave before of like with the lights, increasing the light and decreasing the light. Like, well, what if the he gave another example of like people who look at successful companies and they go and ask the successful people, like, why are they successful? And they give a recount of the things that they did. And then he asked the author of this one book who had done something like that, well, did you go and look at and talk to the people who had failed companies? And he said, no, why would I do that? And he has said because oftentimes when you actually go look at the people who failed, they oftentimes did the same thing that the people who did that succeeded. So it becomes this question of like, well, if you're just kind of looking at like, say, for example, with the pitchers who don't fit your model, but yet are successful, you're like, oh, they're outliers. And then you go look at the people who are not successful doing the exact same thing, who don't fit your model and you quote unquote change. Um, that might not be the real differentiator there as to like what is really causing them not to be successful.
Right, because then as you brought it up, with the pitchers that don't fit the model, then you might also say, oh, they're outliers too. But then if you have outliers on both sides, that's a really bad model either way, because
right
then
right.
you're just creating your own deviation between the people that are in the model. Whereas, pitcher A and pitcher B are on opposite ends of outliers, but then pitcher C, D, E, and F are within it. But within that grouping, they are so varied in their, pitch classification or whatever you want to classify by, where it becomes to the point where what are you really trying to classify? And now you're just asking the question, okay, are we really trying to classify anything, or did we just build a model and not try to do anything about it?
And two, well, I'm thinking about like these overlays that you were talking about. I'm like, ooh, it'd be cool to see the overlays of, all the different hits, or maybe like I want to see an overlay of let's use Trout as an example since there are several of those out there, of like him hitting a pitch up in the zone, a fastball up and a fastball down, in certain locations, or like, hey, let's do an overlay of all the fastballs, or let's do an overlay of all the breaking balls. Let's do an overlay of, like to the question that I'd asked to the group about, with fastballs, like when guys swing and miss, where do they tend to swing and miss on four seam fastballs? Do they tend to miss over, miss under? Like what? It'd be cool to get an overlay of like all fastballs that guys have missed and just to see like, hey, where are they missing? Obviously there'll be some variation there, but I wonder if there may be some common themes that emerge from that, that could lead to useful strategies to trying to improve that outcome of increasing contact rate with, say, for example, a fastball.
Yeah.
So that would be something that I think you could use the overlays to ask a lot of different questions to, just beyond looking at adjustability and or tunneling or whatever. You could begin to ask a lot more questions.
Right, because then it becomes a question of, with that data that was presented, you see that there's a lot of whiffs, but how are they whiffing? Are they swinging over it? Are they swinging under it? You see that most of the time, it's whiffs, but you don't really know what kind of whiffs they are. Are they? You can guess by essentially saying, all right, well, the next highest frequent point is they're getting under it a lot. But does that necessarily mean this when they whiff, they're also getting under it, or are they just getting over it? And then you can kind of factor in other things like location. They might be getting under it, when it's up in the zone, but they might be getting over it when it's down in the zone. Who knows? But again, it's just for this purpose of asking more questions.
Right. And two, I think when we're thinking about the data, and what baseball savant can provide for us, like that's one part of the equation. So like all the hard numbers minus the video tell one story, but when you can bring the two together, it begins to paint a clearer picture. And so that's, when we're talking about whiff rates, that only tells part of the story. When you actually pull up the video and you actually look at, how are they moving when that happens? And I think, who was it? Was it Caleb that had put out a video of two swings on, they were slightly different pitches, but one was a home run with Bellinger and another was a swing and a miss.
Right. Yeah.
And it was like, he basically moved the same. So if we're going to talk about how he had a movement flaw when he missed the ball is kind of like, I don't know if that's necessarily true. If it was simply that like it was a mechanical flaw that caused him to miss that ball,
Right.
because he basically, it looks like to the naked eye that he used basically the same mechanics to hit the ball
Right.
out. So is it really that, or is it more complicated than
Right.
that?
Or could it be something like internal focus, where maybe one pitch he was like, all right, I'm going to try to hit the top of the baseball. But then the next pitch, I'm going to try to hit the bottom of the baseball. And,
Or we could go back to what we were talking about before. He was anticipating a certain pitch, and through that anticipation, he wasn't as locked into picking up information from the ball. Therefore, he was slightly off in terms of his swing.
right. And another thing with like commonalities with I know at my high school, at least when I played, like when you knew this guy had a big fastball, you're like, I'm ready, I'm going to swing. But then maybe, Bellinger knew that, hey, this guy had a good big fastball. Hey, I'm going to swing quicker, on the first swing rather than the second swing, where he's like, I'm geared up for it, I'm ready. But then when it does come, he thinks the perceived velocity is actually higher than it is.
Yeah, and two, I'd have to actually go back and look to try to see what the count was. Like, because count makes a difference. Different pitchers also would make a difference in terms of that, and so yeah. But I'm curious, do you know um how to look up that video? Like, if somebody wanted to be able to pull, you know, video the way that we were talking about it being clipped per pitch, do you know how would one find that on Baseball Savant?
So I would say better yet, instead of going on Baseball Savant, I'll share my screen. All right, so instead of actually going through Baseball Savant, now that MLB has their own video search database, it's just mlb.com/video/search. You can now
Okay.
create kind of these sequences. So of that at bat, while I pull it up real quick, before I forget that, but of that at bat, you can be able to say, okay, you essentially just create filters, and it's essential since the video database is so big. You don't want to. You want to just boil it down to whatever you need to boil it down to. So going back, we see that there are two different pitches, and they're essentially in the same zone. But you essentially pick, okay, so the one on the left where he hit a home run was against Michael Waka. So what you do is you go back into this, and you'll essentially just select batter, type in Cody Bellinger, and then pitcher, Michael Waka. And if you knew it was a home run, you'd go over the play filter and you'd say hit result, go down to home run. And you can see right here, you pull it up. I'll mute the volume, but you have it pulled up, video plays, boom, home run. So essentially, if you know batter, if you know pitcher, and if you know result, you can pull it up rather quickly. Now for like certain like balls and strikes. So like if you want to look at, Cody Bellinger like taking a strike, you can go to game and it allows you to select like certain counts. So that's another thing you can add. So the other one I think was with Chris Paddock. So we'll replace that and we'll say Chris Paddock. I believe it was him. And then instead of saying home run, we'll say, well, I guess we can't, instead of saying hit result, we'll say pitch result, and we're on a swinging strike. It lets me click on it. It's thinking. But yeah, sometimes it does take some time because again, it's filtering through a very large database. Yeah, it's definitely.
Yeah, man, it's slowing down your internet. Because I bet you there were a lot of swing and misses.
But so we have these 4. So now we can. I don't know the exact date, but you essentially at least now have 4. So I remember Paddock was wearing a away jersey, like a gray jersey. So it's either one of these two. So it might have been a strikeout, it might have been a swinging strike, but you just guess and check. So again, I will put this on mute and see. So it's a little bit outside, so it wasn't necessarily that one. So you can exit out of that and go to this one. And essentially, there, it's about the same pitch. Again, it was an 0-2 count. So you understand that when it was Waka, there was 1 strike. With Paddock, there was 2 strikes. So when you brought up count, that might have played a factor too.
Well, or the fact that it was just a different pitcher.
Exactly.
And 2, though, I think there are, go back to home runs by Paddock or with because I think there was a few where he had actually hit a home run off of him too. So it'd be interesting to see just from the standpoint of like, was it a fastball that he hit out? Like what pitch did he hit out? Obviously we could pull this off of Savant.
That one was a changeup, but you can actually, I believe so. Yeah. So
that was a changeup away.
So pitch type, you can actually select the pitch type as well, and be able to say, okay, well, we only want to see fastballs. We only want to see, how many fastballs. So, and another thing you can actually do, because the video search is limited, because right now it doesn't tell you, you can't filter by like pitch location. So if you like when you mentioned with Trout, you only want to see his pitches up and in or his pitches down and in. That's where you can go on to say Baseball Savant. Of course, it's the first thing that comes up because I use it frequently. Then you can say, all right, go to batter, and we'll say batters. Just type in Trout. And then we go to our game day zone. So I think this is from the catcher's perspective. So you said up and down and in. So now you go 1 and 7. Now you select, let's say, fastballs in this case, and we'll select all StatCast. And let's just we can sort by just about anything. So I'll just say average exit velocity. So just hit search, and you can see 472 pitches. You just click on it, and you have all of these. But now that you have kind of this information, not only you can save it as a CSV, so don't forget about that, because then what essentially you can do from a coding perspective is you can manipulate this URL up here by saying, okay, replace this with Mike Trout, replace this with the pitcher that he's up against, and then it'll automatically filter those videos. So I know that the video search has every video from 2017 to the present. So 2016 and 2015 may be a little bit harder to find with plays.
If you scroll back down, it looks like a lot of the videos are now linked.
Right. So, I mean, you could also, video if you're doing like something specific.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. But then once you kind of go down here, now it's like, okay, what if I'm interested in this Mike Trout ground out on a pitch in to the second baseman? So now you would essentially just go, okay, I know that the game date was September 3rd. I know the count was 1-1. So essentially what you'll do is I'll just clear all these. And now instead of saying Cody Bellinger, let's do Mike Trout. And we know that the count was 1-1. So 1 ball, 1 strike. And then it was the 2017 season. And the pitcher was Martin Perez, from what we saw. So we just type in Martin Perez. And we can still get that video either way.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have this video. So a fastball up and in, and he grounded out to the right side. But as you brought up, you can see how, once you kind of get these videos, so essentially what you can do is the share button, you just copy this URL and you just save it into, save that URL. And then that way you can be able to kind of get these videos and then create your overlays in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, so like for most of the time, yeah, especially with recent, so like 2019, you're going to have a ton of video that's already available if you're like on a specific thing. But like something that I was curious about was this. So I was interested on two-seam fastballs and sinkers from right-handed pitchers and left-handed batters that were hit for home runs. And the thing was, the pitch not only had to be away, but actually down and away out of the zone. So 13, so this is from the catcher's perspective again, 13 being out of the zone. So I select that and let's see, and I say the PA result, I want it to be home runs. And then I'll say sort by average exit velocity. But I select all the StatCast era, left-handed batter, right-handed pitcher. I was curious because two-seam fastballs and sinkers are running away from the left-handed batter. How can these batters pull it for a home run? So then you could also go to, let's see, if I remember where, batted ball direction, and you just select pull. And you hit search. And there may not be very many because again, it's a pitch that's shouldn't be designed that is a two-seam or a sinker that's going down and out of the zone to be pulled by a left-handed hitter for a home run. And so you see that there's only been 4 of those instances, and Ryan Flaherty hit 2 of them. So unfortunately, these were in 2015, and when I did look them up earlier, the video wasn't there. And Ryan Schimpf, there's nothing appearing there for a play result. And then Carlos Santana. So we have 2017. And so we know that the count's 3-1. And we know that he's against James Shields. So we say James Shields in this case. And instead of Mike Trout, we'll say Carlos Santana. And now instead we'll say 3-1. And it should be this one right here. So now we look at this pitch, two-seam that's going out of the zone, yet Santana still pulls it out for a home run in a windy city like Chicago. So that's the beauty of video search.
And two, it helps like 13, that zone, it encapsulates such a big part of outside the zone. Basically like belt high and down is 13, like
right.
If you go back up to when it pops up the zone. So if you look at 13, it covers a large area. Well, that pitch was borderline 11, like it was, it wasn't like down and away, like by 7, you know what I mean? Like it was up by 4. And so I think that's where, okay, that makes more sense that it wasn't just down and away. Like that's unfortunately like the hard part about those pitches. Like I get why they made the zone the way they did, because they're probably like, we don't care what happens in that zone very often, or at least the assumption is that we don't. But I mean, that's where it becomes, that's more interesting. Like zone 17, right? Like zone 17 or zone 27.
If someone a left-handed hitter were to pull a home run that way, I know from my experience using this, it's a little bit harder to search for because I think they don't use these, or they don't have it ready for 2015 and 2016 yet.
Mm-hmm.
So they have it from 2017 in the present. So I kind of just go to game day zones, but again, we can just try it out right now and see. So instead of selecting 13, let's say, like you mentioned, 17 or 27. And if nothing comes up, we could also search for right-handed hitters against left-handed pitchers.
Mm-hmm.
The other side. So we search that up, and again, like if video doesn't come up for it, video doesn't come up for it. But you can still see, oh, hey, that's kind of cool that someone hit a opposite field home run, or I should say, a pulled home run on a pitch that was down and away in this sense.
Well, and they have exit velos on that too. And you look at Carlos Santana's EV on that, it was 98.
It was
and whereas
right.
the other two were like 100 plus. So kind of goes to what you're saying of it being the Windy City there.
Right. Yeah. So then you can see, like, with the attack zones, well, there's no results. So now
Mm-hmm.
let's instead say 19 and 29, and then switch the pitcher and batter handedness.
Well, and
So
two, maybe it'll occur. There's more likelihood of it occurring with it being a righty, just because there may be
righties are
more
more
right.
frequent.
Yeah.
So
But the matchup might be harder because there aren't as many lefty pitchers as
right.
righty pitchers. So I guess that might play a role there.
So I guess I'll ask you this: what's more impressive than a pulled home run from left or right-handed batter against the opposite hand who throws a two-seamer sinker, or the same hand who throws a two-seamer sinker? Because when let's say you have a righty, you already know that pitch is starting away. It might come back to the zone, but again, that's why maybe they track it better, to be able to come back to the zone, or a pitch that starts in the zone and starts to go away. So there's no results here.
So I wonder now if you were to change it from batted ball pull, now what if you were to go just eliminate that and just go all fields, and let's just see, because I think just in general that if that ball goes out, like, that's incredibly difficult. So not just pull, like, can you even hit that ball out?
Right. And so, like, it would take a lot, but exactly. So it would take a lot of strength to be able to pull that ball going down and away. And again, like, this should happen for everybody who uses the StatCast search. Like, it's going to take time to load because it's going through all the queries. So Renato Nunez and Alex Rodriguez are the only two players to have a pull. And so this one is in 2017, so we can actually look that up, from Martin Perez. So let me look at the count. So the count was actually 1-2 as well.
That's pretty
cool. So that's the other thing that's impressive. So 1-2, and we'll say Renato Nunez against, I wonder if I can type in his last name, but I'll just type in his first name. Martin Perez. So this one. So that pitch looked like it was in the zone, but it was still hit for a home run. So maybe it was like this just edge of 19, so it's like somewhere between 9 and 19.
Well, isn't the strike zone that dotted line?
Yes. So yeah, it could have been in that top right corner of that 19.
Mm-hmm.
So then obviously with A-Rod, you probably can't pull that up. Since, yeah, we can try it though. So let's try it, see if anything comes up. But more than likely not, because again, like, there's data from 2017 to the present in terms of video. But once you go past that, it's kind of like I don't want to say a wasteland, but a little bit harder to find. So I'll just type in A-Rod, and so it automatically comes up, no video available. because again, having video for every single pitch, that's a lot of memory and storage. So, but yeah, so there's a ton of stuff you can do with Statcast video search, and like I said, I would say start with MLB's video search if you know like a specific player and what you want to look at. So like in Caleb's case, like Cody Bellinger fastballs, you can be able to see that. But if you don't, maybe if you're missing variables, you can go to Statcast and say, well, if there's already video there, great. But if not, you can go back to the video search and be able to get that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is my TED Talk.
Dude, I think this is great just because I think, it makes me wonder, like, where do a lot of people get their videos from? And I think this is probably the easiest way to go get those videos and to go look at them and to do that observation yourself and that kind of study and analysis. So, yeah, I mean, I highly encourage people to make use of it. I think, as much as we rag on MLB, and I think there's, rightly so to a certain extent, for hitting people with a lot of copyright, and not letting people like row the game, so to speak. I think the reason that they put out all this free data, though, in this video is to try to actually grow the game. Like, I think they're understanding, like, coaches and other people, like, I mean, this should be used for marketing. Like, people can take it and make gifts and all sorts of other things. I think it would help grow their game tremendously. But, this is one thing that I think MLB has done different than a lot of other sports, and it's been to their benefit. Like, I think they've reaped some of the benefits, of them doing that and having all this data out there. It's allowed them to get into analytics a lot sooner than other sports.
Right.
You were on the football analytics roundtable.
Yeah.
Where is football on the analytics side of things? Do you know?
So football's starting to grow. Someone, I think his name's Seth Walder, he recently published like known people who are working for NFL teams.
Mhm.
And some of these departments are starting to grow. I think the Eagles at the time had the deepest kind of like analytics staff, but every year what the NFL does is they do kind of the big data bowl. And what essentially that does is they give you kind of advanced data. Most of the time, it's like player tracking, where all the players are essentially dots and they move as as the play happens. So with some of the stuff, like some of these people are like creating really, really cool stuff where you're essentially, I know one guy, can't remember his name, but he did a really good presentation on like predicting offensive line movements, understanding, okay, if you know like who's going to blitz, can you better predict, the offensive line moving that? Or better yet, if you know that maybe you didn't account everybody for a blitz, can your model be able to predict that offensive line, accounting for that and making that adjustment on the fly, within less than seconds, but milliseconds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
on the football end, it's picking up, and then they just had one on basketball as well, and that's another thing that's been picking up as well. So I know, but on the thing that like we just talked about, like that video side of the MLB has a huge advantage because you don't have. Yes, you may be able to share, those clips maybe on the NFL side, but it's not as presently available as right now the MLB video search is compared to other sports. So they have that advantage.
Good stuff. What do you want to wrap up on? We've been going for a good little bit here.
I did not realize it's 8:30 already.
Yeah.
Good Lord. I mean, if you want to end on Modus, we can.
I feel like that's its own long conversation. So,
all right, sounds good.
Yeah, I guess I would highly encourage people to look up David Snowden and the CFIN framework. that's been recently shared in my circles, and I've really liked it a ton. I mean, it's the guy who talks about it, David. He's worked in IT, is my understanding, um, and a lot of software development, and so he spends a lot of time talking to that audience in terms of how to create better software, and working in teams. But the application of what he's talking about applies very much to sports, and not just like the coach on the ground with the athlete, but to organizations as well. Like this is an organizational type framework, that talks about how to work in teams. Um, and so there's just a ton of application for anybody who wants to dive into something and figure out how to translate that to baseball. Um, so that's going to preoccupy some of my time moving forward, is trying to just understand this framework a little bit better, and then try to figure out also how to articulate it, because I don't think today I did it justice. This is just me like first dabbling in it a little bit. But hopefully over time, as just the same as how I've gotten into ecological dynamics and being better able to explain that and the constraint led approach and all that sort of stuff, that's improved over time. I think it'll take me a little bit to be able to articulate this kind of framework well. So anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and then be sure I've appreciated the different people who have been listening to our older podcasts and been hitting us up on social media. So that's been really cool.
Absolutely. Highly appreciate that.
So again, if you want to reach out to us, it's GBOYUM01 on Twitter, or Robert, your handle is
At Robert Fry 40, so capital ROBERT, capital FREY, not FRYE, FREY 40, ROBERT FREY 40.
No underscore, no spaces.
No underscore, no spaces.
All together.
All together. So yeah, if you have any questions about the StatCast video search or the MLB.com video search, like, do not hesitate to reach out to me. I am on that thing probably a couple hours every day, just because a lot of things, again, like a project I'm working on is being able to overlay, StatCast data with the actual video is something that obviously I'm not going to share publicly, but kind of my own internal research. So I am on a lot. So I feel like I'm pretty well versed in it. So if you have any questions on like how to search and how to best optimize your searching skills, like, do not hesitate to reach out.
You heard it first here on Finding the Edge podcast. Till next time.
Analyzing.